members was one of the suffragettes.
Oh,
They-
what was that?
Good
but that
evening,
was
everyone.
before you- Yeah.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jasper. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers, Saskatoon. This event is being held on Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, Dene, Soto, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of She Won the Vote, Vote for Women by Robert E. Hawkins. Thank you to Robert for joining us tonight and for working with us to make this event possible, and thank you all for coming tonight. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so there's a web camera just up to your right here. We're not filming the audience, so don't worry about that. However, if your phone goes off in the middle of the event, it might be captured by the web camera and live on the internet forever. So please mute or silence your phones. If you'd like to buy copies of She Won the Vote for Women, we have some up on the signing table here and also on the desk by where you first walked in. And you're welcome to get your book signed before you purchase it. We just ask that you please do remember to stop by the cash desk on your way out. Now I would like to introduce our author this evening. Robert E. Hawkins is the past president and vice chancellor of the University of Regina and a retired law professor in the Johnson Shayama School of Public Policy. He recently served for 12 years as a Regina City Councillor. He has published extensively in leading Canadian law journals on constitutional and administrative law and on the legal history of the Prairie region, where his research brought Lillian Beynon Thomas to his attention. Everyone, please give Robert a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Jasper.
How's that?
Perfect.
We'll see.
I want to begin by thanking McNally Robinson for hosting this event so well. We had supper in the Prairie Inc. restaurant next door. If I fall asleep in the middle of the talk, that's the reason. It was delicious. I also want to thank Great Plains Press, who published this book. Took a bit of a chance on it. They were wonderful editors and publishers to work for. And frankly, I want to thank you for being present tonight on what may be the warmest night of the year, and you might have been tempted to sit out on the deck with a beverage. So I'm very grateful to you for coming out. I'm going to refer to the main character in my biography, Lillian Beynon Thomas, simply by her first name, Lillian. On and off, one way or another, this book has been in gestation for 2 decades. And over that period of time, Lillian and I have gotten to know each other very well, and we're on a first name basis now. In the next few minutes, I hope to show you how Lillian's campaigns to provide settler women with better laws for economic and personal protection and laws which would grant them the right to vote were realized both not only in Manitoba, where I grew up, but also in Saskatchewan. Lillian had close ties with Saskatchewan, and I'm going to focus some of my talk on those ties. In both provinces, she had inventive organizational skills, and the power of her written and spoken word was inspirational. It motivated women to try one more time in a campaign for suffrage after so many had been a failure. One of the reviewers of the book mentioned, or 2 actually, used the word inspirational to describe Lillian Beynon Thomas. I checked, I never used the word in my book, but in fact, she was truly inspirational. Lillian, you often hear it said that I'm going to do politics in a different way. Well, Lillian did politics in a different and in an innovative way. She overcame an entrenched, smoke-filled backroom political machines, all run by men, of course. And instead, she brought forward a grassroots campaign, a campaign which reached out directly to the women and to the men she was trying to convince. And she did that through canvassing, through petitioning, through letter writing, through lobbying, and especially, and I'm going to talk about this tonight, especially through networking, tying groups of women like yourselves, together in a common cause. In 1906, John Defoe, the legendary editor of the Manitoba Free Press, hired Lillian, then a fledgling journalist, to edit the women's page in the Prairie Farmer, the Free Press's companion weekly farm supplement, which went out across the prairies, and indeed it was the largest farm weekly newspaper that was read in the prairies. Over the next decade, from 1906, Lillian published more than 700 letters to the editor from lonely and isolated rural women, women who faced subsistence farming in a harsh and lonely rural climate, women who went without support of clubs or networks, women who needed the laws to protect their personal and property rights, often from husbands who were abusive or who absconded, leaving the women to raise the family on their own. Writing under the pseudonym Lillian Laurie, I looked why that pseudonym was adopted and never found it. In any event, Lillian Laurie was her pseudonym. She would reply to the letters that she received in print, giving editorial comment, sometimes sharp editorial comment, practical advice, and often friendly comfort. Columns resembled, as you read them, something akin to today's radio phone-in show. As the years went by, Lillian's column evolved from one dealing with recipes, beauty tips, how to get a man, household hints, and other such topics. It evolved to consider topics that were more political in nature, topics that were called kindred rights. In other words, the political rights that women were claiming all had something that connected them, the desire to provide better economic and personal protection. Those rights included things like property laws. The law of dower was abolished in Manitoba in 1885, in Saskatchewan the next year, and then returned in 1915 in Saskatchewan, 1916 in Manitoba. Dower is the right of a woman to some portion of the property acquired by her husband during the marriage. She campaigned for dower, but she campaigned for equal guardianship laws. At the time, men had guardianship rights over the children, and women didn't have them, except that women were expected to raise them if the husband absconded. She complained for inheritance laws, which would protect a woman's interest if her husband left no will or left her without any property. And of course, she campaigned for franchise reform. She maintained that the women's horizons had extended beyond simply the four walls of the home, out into the bigger world, where women are starting to find employment and where their children are going out to find new jobs in big cities, for example. Lillian's reputation spread across the West. One of her fellow journalists wrote that she had become established, and I quote, as one of the foremost amongst the champions of prairie womanhood. Another wrote, she is regarded as a friend in every Western home, and went on, she touches the very heart of women's affairs. Lillian created a club out of the women who corresponded with her in the newspaper. She called that club the Mutual Benefit Association, reflecting the fact that women would write in for hints, for help, and other women would reply and say, oh, well, I know how to pickle bees or clean a wool rug. So she called it the Mutual Benefit Association. And she described the women who wrote in and joined the club as being made up as of fine women who ever banded together for any good reason. So you have a sense of the intimacy that Lillian had with farm women across the prairies. Lillian's column, as I mentioned, was read across Saskatchewan. In July 1910, Hedley Auld, superintendent of fairs and institutes with the Saskatchewan Department of Agriculture, invited Lillian to address meetings held in conjunction and you people will recognize this, in conjunction with the annual farmers' excursion to the Dominion Experimental Farm in Indian Head. And she did it. And he told her to stay away from politics. Well, she didn't trespass too far into politics, but she got in a word by raising the possibility that women in rural districts should form associations to combat their loneliness and to provide mutual support. Auld relented a bit, and he invited her again to speak in January 1911 in Regina to the annual Agricultural Societies Convention, which were held in that city. She did that. In Regina that week, the leader press reported that it was a week in which it was notable for its biting cold, wind, and snow. When I wrote up that part of the book, it was the last week of January, and it was cold and biting snow and wind. And so I had just a little bit of an insight about what it meant for Lillian to come from Winnipeg by train to Regina, all bundled up because she believed in a cause. That led to the Extension Division of the University of Saskatchewan's Department of Agriculture, brand new at this time, employing her to promote the formation of clubs, what came to be known as the homemakers clubs in Saskatchewan. Some of you will have heard of homemakers clubs. On the campus, there's a plaque honoring the homemakers clubs. Well, it was Lillian Beynon Thomas who formed them. Clubs were connected with adult education, in particular homemaking courses. They were concerned with community services, such as rural restrooms for women. Women and men would bring their families into towns to do shopping on Saturday. The men would go off and talk about farm equipment or whatever. The women would have the kids. They needed a place to go. And these clubs established prairie restrooms. I grew up in Dauphin, Manitoba, about 150 years ago around this time. And there was a restroom on Saturday in the town hall for people coming into town to do their shopping. And she raised issues like the need for rural medical help and the importance of rural nurses for helping rural families. Some things don't change all that much, actually. In 1911, she did the summer fair circuit. Coming up, I guess, traveling to North Battleford, Prince Albert, here in Saskatoon, Moose Jaw, my home in Regina, organizing clubs. And then the next summer, she rode the CPR line to touch base with people who were forming clubs in Briarcliff, Pence, Cottonwood, Grand Coulee, Bladworth, Noland, and so on. So she was very active in the formation of clubs. Years later, she used the following words to describe her role, creating what she called, and these are her words, a sisterhood of women. To outsiders, we no doubt looked to be just an ordinary group of women, but we knew that we were not just ordinary. We knew that we were helping to build a nation. Money was scarce, terribly scarce in those days, but every woman there was wealthy. Her wealth consisted of her dreams, and what is money compared with the pale shadow of a dream? She also, in another quote, described these fairs, and she's described how the people came to the fair to look at the exhibitors, but the exhibitors, as Lillian was exhibiting displays for the University of Saskatchewan, the exhibitors looked at the people coming to the fair, and in a funny piece, she wrote about that. Lillian had a problem, however, because the homemakers clubs were formed under the auspices of the University of Saskatchewan. They were not allowed to discuss political topics such as dowry reform or votes for women. But Lillian found a way around this. Think back to 1913, pressure was building in both the Manitoba and in the Saskatchewan grain growers associations. Pressure to allow the formation of separate women's sections of these associations. Farmers were interested in this possibility described as a clandestine get-together in her bedroom where the two women plotted as to how to get a women's section formed in Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association. And they were successful, the plot worked. Unlike the restrictions on the homemakers clubs, the women's section of the SGA was able to take up political causes in support of women's rights and in support of suffrage. The next year, Beynon went on to become the first president of the women's section, but only after she, and these are her words, she panic-stricken, sought out in desperation Lillian's advice on public speaking. Lillian mentored her colleague, sharing the same speaking and organizational skills which Lillian had pioneered in the Manitoba suffrage campaign. I mentioned at the beginning of our talk that in addition to these very unique developed organizational skills, Lillian was able, through her written and spoken advocacy, to inspire women in their effort to overcome the entrenched, and it was entrenched, opposition to suffrage. Listen to her words as she addressed the assembled delegates to that 1913 Saskatchewan Grain Growers Association convention just down the road. If there were no tired men, broken-hearted women, and suffering children, I would not be here tonight. But because these do exist, I, in common with many others, have felt that the cause of women's suffrage exerts a force it is my duty to follow. So often have I realized the sad condition of life. So often have I seen delegations of women returning from legislatures and parliaments in despair. We go there bearing a tale of life and death, and we are received politely and kindly, yet come away with the knowledge that what was vital to a human life has been traded and given place to something desirable to a property holder. She's thinking of dower. Women's place is in the home, I hear. But do you think it is part of a mother's mission to sit quietly by and see her sons and daughters growing up under conditions which she knows are bad, but through lack of power is unable to remedy? I hope this convention will declare in favor of women's suffrage. It did. 3 years later, Lillian displayed the same passion in her exhortation to the women of Manitoba contained in the Prairie Farmer during the fall 1915 canvass, which ultimately resulted in enfranchisement in Manitoba. Column was entitled Manitoba Women Wide Awake, and Lillian wrote, "There are still a few women in the province of Manitoba who do not know that there is some remarkable activity among the women, but they are very few. Up and down, from north to south and east to west, there are women talking positions, walking with petitions, and sending others out with petitions. The women have been stirred up as the women have never been stirred before. And what has been called the better half of this province is aroused, there's going to be some result. The women of Manitoba who are working to get the petition are dreaming new and greater dreams than ever before. They are dreaming of the great work that women of this province, now that they are stirred up, can do but to better conditions. They are dreaming of the day when the liquor traffic will be banished, when every child will be compelled to get an education, and those with mental illnesses will have a home in which they can be cared for. They are dreaming of the time when our treatment of criminals will be more humane, when our idea of university education will be an education for the many, not the few. But who can tell all the dreams that lighten the long walks and drives our canvassers, dreams that may make of Manitoba, when dreamed of by men and women working together, a province to which other provinces will look for inspiration to make new and better conditions of life, not for the few, but for all. the same petitioning was going on in Saskatchewan. These words remind me of Tommy Douglas's 1944 speech, Dream No Little Dreams. The speech delivered 30 years after Lillian's time while he was campaigning for the introduction of Medicare in our province. I wrote Lillian's biography because I believe there was a gap in the history of prairie women's suffrage that needed to be filled. Lillian's contribution, so central to the organization of the successful drives, and her inspirational words, those deserve their place in history. I wrote it for another reason. It is possible that Lillian's contribution has been overshadowed by the more charismatic contribution of a name we all recognize, Nellie McClung, the leading spokesperson in the suffrage campaign. It is often the case that political reform is the result of overlooked figures working quietly in the background. Those folks deserve their recognition in history, and that is certainly true of the case of Lillian Beynon Thomas. I hope that you'll have occasion to read the book, and I hope you will agree with me that her contribution deserves recognition. Thank you for being such a patient audience. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know there's one good question over here, and I postponed it.
I have a microphone I can bring as well, so everyone can hear the questions.
So she wasn't a part of the famous five then?
No,
It's like,
no, and
that
it's
was
a,
Nellie McClung and.
it's a good observation.
Right,
I often thought, this should be the famous six.
right.
She was completely overlooked. And indeed, when she passed away in 1964, there was a rather standard form obituary in the Free Press and nothing further. In the Winnipeg Tribune at the time, there was one story, and the story was headlined, "She won the vote for women."
Do we have other questions in the audience here?
I appreciate you having written this book, but I'm curious as your own personal interest in the Lillian and why you might have written the book.
I'm pleased for the question. It was entirely by chance, and it came about in this way. I guess about 40 years ago, when I was a fairly young law prof, I was teaching a property law course, an area in which I didn't pursue very much, but I was teaching this course because being young, the dean has to find someone to teach it, and it was me. I came across, I was talking about dower, and I came across the fact that dower had been abolished in the prairie provinces in 1885 and 6. It was abolished because it was thought to impede the transfer of land. In a land title system, every claim on the land has to be listed in the land titles. But dower was a common law claim. It just, if you got married, you got some portion of the land. And it wasn't in the land title system. And that caused all kinds of traffic and havoc with the transfer of land. And so they abolished it. But then I found out that it was returned in 1917. Now, this is unusual. And I did a little bit of research at the time and discovered Lillian Beynon Thomas's name. And I did a little more research, and I put it all in the banker's box. Now, this would be in about 1998. And the banker's box went into the basement. And it moved with Marie-France and I and our family across the country as I climbed up the university administrative ladder. And about 5 years ago, I was cleaning out the basement, and the box was there. And I was marching out to the garbage with the box. And I just turned around and said, there's something in here. I should look at this again. And I did some more research, and I wrote the book. So that's how she came to my attention. And indeed, I was inspired by her.
I'm sorry to have come in late, and you may have mentioned this already. Do you think there was something about her that made her able to do this?
What a good question. Let me start by talking a bit about Nellie McClung, who was a good friend of Lillian's. Nellie McClung was truly charismatic. She got on the stage and everybody, even her male opponents, paid attention. She was very funny and very clever, and she was a very good authoress. Nellie used a lot of emotion in her speaking, very colorful. Lillian was the exact opposite. Lillian was rational, and she believed that the only way you could convince people was through education. And she was a teacher. She saw herself through her written work as educating the people on the need for the vote, or for dower, or for guardianship laws, or homestead laws, for all of those things. And she didn't use emotion, she used logic. There was a meeting in Brandon in the fall of 1915, and a man got up in the crowd and asked Lillian why she wasn't at home looking after the kids when the kids starving. Lillian didn't have any children, but Lillian, that moved her to say, no, and here's why I'm here. Nellie McClung recorded afterwards, it was a rare instance of Lillian becoming very passionate. And she said Lillian tore the fellow to pieces. He left the room, head hanging down. So she was a very different kind of person than Nellie McClung. The other thing that was amazing about her, she was very persistent. So the campaigns for dower had failed in Saskatchewan and Manitoba over a number of years. Before 30 years, I guess. In Manitoba, the Icelandic women in Gimli had run in the 1890s campaign for dower, which the government had just ignored. Lillian, driven by the need primarily by the need to reinstate dower, but other women's causes as well, said, we'll never get them if we just keep going to hat in hand to the government. We just not going to get anywhere. We have to do something differently. And she got together a small group of people, and they formed something called the Political Equality League. And that started in Winnipeg, spread throughout Manitoba. That was her way of reaching out, her way of doing politics differently. Interestingly enough, I didn't mention this, in 1915, the suffragettes in Regina invited her to come out. She gave a speech, again, it was in the winter, I think February. She gave a speech in which she talked about how to form political equality leagues. And so it's another example of her using the formation of clubs, using networks to reach out to bodies of women. And of course, she reached out to the Canadian Council of Women, the Women's Labor Federation, the University Women. She formed, she was one of the co-founders of the Alumni Association at Wesley College, then the branch of the University of Manitoba, subsequently the University of Winnipeg. She was one of the two founders of that organization. She reached out to them, and it wasn't always easy for her. Some of the women's clubs, Council of Women in particular, were very hesitant to sign on. And they were hesitant for pretty good reason. They were afraid that their husbands would lose their jobs or would be shunned. But Lillian convinced them that the cause was worth it. And so in the end, when she went with a delegation to Premier Roblin, for those of you who remember, Duff Roblin's grandfather actually, went to see him. She was accompanied by large numbers of women.
This is more a story than a question.
Good.
My great uncle was the first president of the first farmers union, Kelvington and Ituna Local.
Oh, wow.
And LP McNamee was his name. He's in the Agriculture Hall of Fame here. Well, he and my grandpa went to hear Tommy Douglas, and I was with them. I was about 10 years old. And my Uncle Lou says to him, "What do you know about farming? You've never been a farmer." He said, "Well, I've never been a chicken either, but I make a really good omelet."
That's a great story.
But a more serious part of that is that when they were organizing farmers, it was considered communist, and the RCMP were coming to their farm, and they saw them coming, and they were having a meeting of farmers from the area, and my aunt Kate quickly put all the bulletins in her purse, and the RCMP didn't look in the lady's purse. So I remember she told me that.
Your story and the story of Lillian and Nellie McClung are a reminder of how powerful oratory could be in politics. I think maybe we've lost some of that at the present time, but
Yes.
Tommy Douglas, he was a lone soul in the wilderness for a long time. Lillian Beynon Thomas, she had to build her own support. These people, Nellie McClung, you may have heard in Winnipeg, they put on a play, a mock parliament. And the mock parliament was the idea was the women had the vote and the men had to come as supplicants for the women, begging for the vote. And this was an idea of Lillian Beynon Thomas's. She actually stole it from a Vancouver organization, and she brought it to Winnipeg. And Redmond Rodman, the premier, the week before this play was to go on, had the women in, and he mocked them. He said, "Your place is in the home." And so they put on this mock parliament, and Nellie McClung, of course, played the role of the premier who was telling the men to get lost. They didn't deserve the vote. That performance, that mock parliament, was instrumental in funding the whole of the women's suffrage campaign, which went on from 1914 to 1916. And in her book, Nellie McClung gives full credit to Lillian Beynon Thomas as the originator of the idea, and I quote, that drove us on to victory. So Lily recognized Lillian's contribution. It's just that we forgot it after a while.
Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Sorry.
Well, just go to say when the wheat pool was being formed, that same uncle who went around, I guess he did speak very well, but his daughter, who was a teacher, would help to put it into writing, because he only had about grade 3 or something in as far as but anyway, he was organizing by passing the hat around all over the province to bring Aaron Shapiro up to help organize the wheat pool in Saskatchewan. And I can remember the women singing from the north, south, east, west, all over the prairie, keep the wheat pool rolling along. But and we young kids were with our parents, and we'd hear them this talk about the wheat, and it was all about trying to get a decent price for their wheat.
We, it almost seems commonplace now to say, well, the Grain Growers Association should have a women's section. It wasn't commonplace at all. They really had to fight and make a case that there should be one.
Yeah. Whose daughter was the women's president for a while, national, but then Nettie Weed became the president, and she was a woman. So she was the first woman to become. That's not very long.
What year did women's suffrage in Saskatchewan? I don't remember the date.
In Manitoba, January 1916. In Saskatchewan, 2 months later, in March 1916. The actual mechanics of how it happened in Saskatchewan are just slightly different. Premier Walter Scott said, I'll do it when women bring me a petition. And so Lillian Beynon Thomas and her sister Frances, through their columns, said to Saskatchewan women, get out there. In that, it was similar to the Manitoba movement. I'm going to tell you something. Even though we're on webcam, we can never repeat it. So when you write something, it's a very difficult thing to read what you write. And I have trouble doing it. But I read my book. My wife read my book and made numerous corrections. My sister read my book and made numerous corrections. I was preparing for this evening, and I read the chunk in about Saskatchewan. And instead of saying March 1916, it says, and I want you to keep this to ourselves, May 1916.
No one will ever know. Do we have any final questions from the audience here? Oh, sorry, yes.
Something further to that. I don't know if I read it about your book or in this collection of stories I was reading about, I think it was Agnes Stowe, and she was another suffragette.
Yes,
And I don't know if it was in there that they said that Quebec was the last one to, and they were quite a bit later. Is that correct?
1940 or something,
Yeah.
way later. Yeah.
Yes, okay, that is correct then. Okay. That's so neat.
Uh, Further questions?
Well, thank you so much for coming
Forward
in.
to reading the book.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you pass along to friends and get them to read it too. Good luck with your club. This is the summer end of winter meeting, is that right?
Yes.
Well, I hope you've had a good evening, and I wish you all the very best in the future. Thank you.